in Teams. Did you just get a notice that it was recording? Oh, there it goes. Yeah. Okay, cool. So we're going to kind of tie together a lot of the stuff we talked about this week. So, you know, anything you learned earlier in the week will be helpful. So the first thing I want to talk about, and we're going to talk about studying for tests and stuff. So this is a skill that's not just a school skill, it's like a work skill too. There are many things about school that do not translate into a job, which are like, that's probably not okay, but like this is something that actually does translate into a job. So this is what we call a life skill, right? It's something that's going to translate into any future. And, you know, maybe jobs that we can't even imagine right now. So the first one is this idea of summary versus gist. So summary is what you've probably been taught to do in middle school and high school so far. And that is you're going to take a reading of some kind and you're going to summarize it, which means to make a short version of that reading. So that's all we mean by summary, is just like, okay, like take that 8 paragraphs and turn it into like 1 paragraph explanation of the thing. Now that's one skill, and it's not unimportant, but the more important skill is the idea of gist, G-I-S-T. Gist means like, what's the point? If you say, well, what's the gist of what you're saying? Or like, can you just give me the gist? I don't need the whole thing. And what we mean by that is not the same thing as summary. What we mean by that is, what is the author's point? What is the point they're making in this reading? Not all the, don't give me like a short version of the whole thing. Just read it and then tell me what's the main idea. What's the point that the author's trying to get across to us? And that's much more useful when you're talking about, you know, like studying for a test, because usually what you're being asked to do is like kind of what's the point, you know, which is what the gist is. So you need to change the way you read a little bit, so you're looking for gist more than for summary, because summary is not going to solve problems for you. Summary is, other than using less paper, summary is like one thing that you might have to do, but gisting is something you do all the time. Like, okay, the teacher's talking, what's their point? Or the author is writing about this topic, what's his point about the topic? Is he in favor of it? Is he against it? Does he think we should not be thinking that way? We should be thinking another way? Like, what is it that the author is trying to get across to us? So does anybody have a problem or not understand what I just explained? Summary versus gist. Okay. All right. So I'm going to tell you about another concept called metacognition. So it's the prefix META, which means like all or everything. And cognition means thinking. So metacognition is a term that teachers use sometimes, usually not with students, but they use it when they're thinking about lessons and stuff. So metacognition is the ability that we all have to like think about what we're thinking about, like being aware of what you're thinking about. So let me give you 2 examples of metacognition working. Have you ever been reading a book or something, you know, a textbook, something for school or whatever, and you get to the bottom of the page and you realize like, oh, I have no idea what I just read? You know that feeling? Like where your eyeballs kept moving, but you weren't like actually reading what was going on the paper, right? You weren't converting those squiggles on a page into actual ideas in your head. And everybody does that. It doesn't make you stupid, doesn't make you dumb, doesn't make you lazy. It's a common thing that people have. Now, I'm going to tell you a little tip about that. The difference between students who do well in classes and the students who don't do well in classes is right there in metacognition. Because the strong student will get to the bottom of the page, go like, oh, I have no idea what I just read, and then they'll read it again. Whereas the weak student will go like, oh, I have no idea what I just read, and then they just keep going. Right? So then they're missing whatever they just spaced out on the page is not going to be in their head. And then they end up in a test and they don't know what the teacher's talking about, and they end up getting a low grade. Another example of metacognition that I'm sure you've experienced is, have you ever watched a movie for the second time and you pick up stuff you didn't catch in the first time? Like, oh, that's the dude's mother-in-law. That's why she's so pissed off. Or, oh, he was the one with the gun. You know, like there's something like you missed the first time and then you like catch it the second time. That's metacognition. That's an awareness that there was a gap in what you understood about the thing that you watched before, right? So that's a really important skill, and it's something you need to cultivate, is the ability to think about what you're processing. You know, if you're sitting there listening to a teacher talk, and this has happened to me a million times, and I'm start thinking about like, yeah, this weekend I'm gonna go hang out with some friends. Hopefully I'll have time on Saturday night to you know, check in with my mom so I don't get in trouble with her. And you realize like, oh man, I just missed like 20 minutes of this, whatever this person was talking about. So this is when you've got to be a little bit courageous and stop the teacher and say like, really sorry, I kind of spaced out there. What were you saying about this thing? Because you need to do that. You need to advocate for yourself. And yeah, the teacher might get annoyed, but they'll repeat themselves because they kind of have to. You're not going to meet many teachers in your school career that are going to say, "Well, you should have paid attention the first time." You know, I'm sure that could happen, but most teachers will. Now, when they really get pissed and maybe won't help is if later now you're taking the test and you're like, "Wait, I didn't get this thing about World War II." Well, it's too late then, right? So the time to ask is when it's first happening. So that's what metacognition means. So I want you to think about this a little bit. Metacognition has to do with Bloom's taxonomy. It has to do with levels of thinking. Like when you can become aware that if you're down in recall and application, those are probably facts that you can find later. But if you're aware that what's going on is analysis or evaluation or creation, you're not going to get that on Google, right? So that's when you really need to stop the teacher and say, whoa, could you go through like a math, like in your math class, and they explain some idea to you, and you're like, okay, cool, I got it. And like, like cross multiplying to determine whatever. But then they do the problem and you kind of space out, like in actually doing it. That's when you need to stop it, because that's analysis. When the teacher's like using the idea to work a problem, that's analysis. So you need to, when you miss the analysis, you're going to get in trouble if you don't stop the teacher and say, wait, could you work another one like that? I'm not sure I get it exactly. So then the teacher has to do another problem, and this time hopefully you're paying closer attention, and then you're like get the analysis, which makes you understand the rule or the principle that the math problem requires, like cross multiplying or multiplying inside the brackets first and then outside the brackets, and those kind of rules. You need to not only know the rule, but you need to see it done. This is why math teachers work problems on the board, and then they make you work math problems as homework, is because you need to do the application and the analysis. Like, oh, okay, like I've got double brackets here. I've got to solve the operation inside the inside brackets first, and then the outside bracket. Like how they teach you to do that. That's analysis, and that's the stuff that you're going to have trouble with in school if you don't stop and recognize, like, I missed that. And that's metacognition. The other thing that I want to talk about is close reading. A lot of people don't know that reading for pleasure is not the same as reading for school. In school, you have to do, especially with textbooks, you have to do what's called close reading. In other words, really focused reading, and it's much slower than reading like for pleasure, like you're reading like, a long post on Instagram or something, or, something that you're doing just for fun or pleasure. You can buzz through that stuff. But the problem is that kind of reading won't work for remembering stuff for a test. So close reading is taking your time and going through it. And you do some things. First of all, you're making notes as you go. So you're going to have to stop on each paragraph and just the paragraph, right? So that slows you down, but it also helps you process what was in that first paragraph. Then you gist it and you put that in your notes. You go on to the next paragraph, you gist it, put it in your notes. So it's slower, but your comprehension is much higher. So you probably know students who like can read the textbook once and then pass the test. That's because they have a high reading comprehension. They are very good at remembering, processing what they just read, and they tend to do well in school. But we can all do well in school by slowing it down and figuring out what's the gist on this one, what's the gist on that one. Another thing you can do is in a textbook, there are section headings, like there's a heading before a couple paragraphs. If you've got a section heading that says rise of the Roman Empire, all right, so what you do with that is you turn that into a question, like what caused the rise of the Roman Empire? And then you answer that question in your notes by reading what comes after that. So it's just a little trick of turning section headings into questions. So you might get one that's like India and China compared. So what you should do is go like, well, what are the similarities and differences between India and China? And then so you make a T-chart and you're right, things about India, things about China. Some of them are similarities, some of them are differences. But turning section headings into questions is a powerful way to increase your concentration on the reading. Questions so far? Okay. So then lastly, what I want to talk about is flashcards. So flashcards is the most useful study technique. The most common thing that students do when they're worried about a test is they'll read the textbook once and then they're like scared, so they read it again. That is the least effective thing you can do. That is the most time consuming and least effective thing you can do. What you're better off doing is the first time through making flashcards based on gist. Like main idea, and then what is it on the backside. And then when you go through the stack of flashcards, or a lot of people do it on Quizlet these days, but as you go through the flashcards, you're having to remember what was in the text, right? And it's in the remembering, or what psychologists call recall. When you recall what was in the text, you're making it stronger in your memory. So it's not every time you read it, it's every time you recall it that helps you understand something so you can do well on a test. So just to recap, so I talked about summary versus gist, and this is getting down to the main idea, the whole point of it. Metacognition is tied to Bloom's taxonomy, right? Being aware, like, oh, okay, I just have to remember these things, or oh, I've got to break this thing down because it's more like analysis, and being aware of what you have to do, and being aware of how well you're comprehending the video that you're watching or the textbook that you're reading or whatever. And then close reading is slowing down and taking time to do it right. If you do close reading, you don't need to reread the text. You'll have it on the first go round. You're going to take longer on the first go round, but you're not going to need to go back for a couple reasons. One is your comprehension will be 100%. But number two is you'll have notes to go back and look at. And what are the best kinds of notes? Well, flashcards. Flashcards are the best kind of notes. So you can go back and practice recalling. Like a really good technique is to give the stack of flashcards to somebody else and have them like, okay, what's the value of exponents and whatever. And then you like answer it. And a lot of times you'll go like, oh, I remember that one. I can't really remember. Well, that's one that you just did metacognition. You just realized you didn't know something. So now you know that's the thing that you need to be studying more. So close reading is tied to memory, right? Like you're working with your memory. Asking questions is a way of increasing your cognition, increasing your ability to process information. So close reading is slow, and it involves note taking, and it involves turning section headings into questions. If you can create questions before you read the text, what you're doing instead of reading is you're mining the text for the answer to that question, which is a more aggressive way to read, right? Because now you're like looking for something. Instead of just passively letting the words go by your eyeballs, I'm looking for the answer to how are the Chinese and the Indians similar and how are the Chinese and the Indians different. Now I'm looking for that in the text, and that changes the way you read for the better. Okay, questions about that? Okay, so all you need to do is maybe jot down some notes and then just go take the test. I'm going to change the settings right now so you've got 2 chances at it, but it's an 8 question quiz, and yeah, that's what you're going to do. So give me 5 minutes to reset that. I meant to make it two tries, but I think I made it 1. Okay, I'll see you guys on Monday at 9:25. Take care. Get it done right now, okay?
Have a good day, Mr. Bingham.
Thank you. You too.